you how to be better at picking colors. And also, you're picking colors based on sort of the wrong criteria. Great designs are ones where every aspect of the design leads toward a very specific sort of functional design goal. And the problem is, when we teach about colors, we teach it in an interestingly left-brain sort of manner, right? Logically, we show this chart, and we say depending on where your color goes in sort of this color circle, we can sort of go to the opposites of scale and mathematically sort of figure out what colors should go together, what colors have a relationship with one another. However, everything that we know about colors from when we grow up from a young age to much older, we have this sort of more personal and sort of emotional interaction with colors. And so I never saw anything about design teaching that sort of teaches that. And you can go back into the history and sort of see that there are some concepts that a lot of people just don't talk about, or a lot of things that are sort of a little bit more obscure. So back in the 19th century, there's a lot of different philosophers who were trying to figure out what is the model of the world. Trying to figure out the shapes upon which all things that we experience in the universe, how do they sort of interact with one another. And when it came to color sort of research in the 19th century, people were trying to figure out what is the shape or the model that we can say all colors can sort of fit on, that we understand that this is how color sort of works. If we can just figure out this model, like a Newtonian model of color, we can better understand it. So this is one that was done called the Faber pyramid that didn't work out very well, and also something called the color sphere. Now, the problems with these two models was they were missing colors. And also, there were colors that was in the visual spectrum of humans that just we couldn't fit onto these objects. So people were still trying to figure out how these things work. And it wasn't until a guy named Albert Manger, who was a painter at the time, looked at the problem, and he came up with a very interesting insight. And this system for devising how colors were represented used three different characteristics: value, hue, and chroma. Right? So value goes from the darkest black to the white, up and down on the axis. Hues was in a circle, going from blue, green, yellow, yellow, red, 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 purple, purple. And then you had chroma going in and out towards the gray, so you get these different gradients. So let's say on the blue, or the purple blue, hue, we have all these different chroma scales for it. He said, this looks like a pretty good model. But the thing that made his model successful is that what he did was he did an experiment where he verified all of these different theoretical color models and had people look at them and say, can you see these? Can you tell the difference between the two? Is there a noticeable difference? And it turns out we don't have perfect ranges of chroma for every single value scale of different colors. And each color had a very different shape in terms of what was available for that hue spectrum. And so what you get is a model, a theoretical model of how colors are related to one another that looks like this, based on the human perceptual system. That means humans have a hard time distinguishing between lower, darker colors of yellow or brighter, lighter colors of red. And so these traditional ways that we learn about understanding color, it's frustrating because sometimes we will start with a color and we say, okay, if I follow this formula, we're supposed to go to the other side of the spectrum and I'm going to pick a color. Well, it turns out, depending on where you start, you won't even have a color there. This is a more complex 3D model of the Manger color system. And to this day, this was devised in the 19th century, this is still one of the most accurate representations. He showed hundreds of thousands of people different colors and color palettes and had to tell them, how does this make you feel? And then he created an emotional map of warm, cool, soft, and hard feelings and said, these are how the colors are matching to it. And this is what the book looks like. So you can both look up a specific color, see other different color palettes, and see how that makes you feel. Or you can look at an index of all different kinds of emotions that you're trying to convey, and then find the color palettes you're going to match it. Which is way more practical, and usually what we're looking for when we're trying to pick a color palette. This book is out of print. Shigenamu Kobayashi died last year, and so usually you'll find an old copy on eBay or what have you. This is a site called Veracity Solutions, and they actually, because this book was done in the 1980s, you can use this sort of graph here to match these two RGB values, because he used the Manger system, which isn't very popular in terms of traditional ways of understanding colors. The next word we're going to get is from Scandinavia, and I call it the Goldilocks word. The word's called lagom. And lagom is an interesting word because it means not too much, not too little, just about right. And what's interesting about it, it's a Swedish word that stems all the way back to the Viking era. And the Vikings, the reason they had a word like this that means having just the right amount, which is interesting for a culture that went and pillaged other villages for getting as much stuff as possible, was that when they'd be done with their pillaging, they'd sit around the table with their mead, and they'd only have one cup, called the Viking horn. They'd fill that up with mead, and they'd pass this horn around to the other Vikings, and you were to have a lagom sip of mead. If you had more, you'd be beaten. If you had too little, you wouldn't get enough, right? And what's interesting about it is that it's amazing to be able to have an abstract unit of measurement, especially in a design critique, right? Because a lot of times, especially for my more advanced designers, they get very hung up on the details, wondering how many pixels do I need to make this? Or how many shades color brighter do I need to make this? They get caught up in all the little things that ultimately I need them to iterate on their own. Like I need them to get to the point where this just feels lagom, as opposed to this needs to be this many iterations. What's interesting is that because lagom is actually part of the sort of national identities of all the Scandinavian nations, you have companies that come out of there that have a different sense and understanding of design and how products should be. So IKEA, which is known for making really well-designed furniture that is at an affordable price, right? And what they figured out was the system was like, everyone wants to have good design, and we're going to figure out how to make it be at the price that makes sense, that is at the just right price. And part of them getting to that point is figuring out, and to a very profitable margin, that what we'll have to do is make them put it together themselves. If they will put the labor into it, right, we can bring this down to a certain price, and then people can get the kind of design and aesthetics that they want. Another large company, H&M, they're all around the world, and they're also known for very, very good high fashion design at a very affordable price. It's somewhat equivalent of Old Navy, but a little bit higher sort of designer sense. They're growing fast, and they're considered, I think, the brand is rated the highest value in their retailer category. And the ideas behind these cultures, like high design, and the way we understand it in most Western cultures, is that people should pay a premium for this, right? And these are two companies that came out of Sweden because they have this idea of lagom, helped them understand, hey, you know what? Everyone sort of wants this. Maybe we can figure out a way so that it's accessible to everyone. And what's interesting is lagom doesn't have to be just about like how many lumps of sugar do you want in your coffee. I want a lagom amount. It's not just measurement. It's also a life philosophy. And it's the reason why, I think a lot of people wonder, why is it that socialism works in the Scandinavian countries and why are we so averse to it? And it has to do with that inside of the culture what is embedded is that we will only take what we need in order to survive. And that will be what's best for the entire sort of country. Where Americans, interesting enough, we have a different premise on human nature. And that in America there's a dream and a promise of having everything that you work hard for, right? We have a concept called manifest destiny, where our country believes that if we can have it, we should have it. And it leads to different kinds of products, different kinds of design experiences, different kinds of valuations on the aesthetics of stuff. And I'll give you a good example of how Norway sort of handles this much better than a lot of other countries. So in Norway, they discovered oil many years ago, and they become very, very rich. And the thing that everyone was worried about with Norway discovering oil is because all the other Middle Eastern countries, including also in Venezuela, they had something called the natural resource curse. And it turns out a poor country that is rich in natural resources tend to have more corrupt and authoritarian governments, and resources aren't distributed amongst the people in a fair way. So the Norwegians, they were determined to overcome this curse. And the way they set this up is they hired an Iraqi geologist named Farouk al-Qasim. And what they figured out was a system where the money that was going to come from all this giant oil reserve that was going to make them rich was going to be done in a way that kept them from being spoiled and sort of turned negative about this natural resource. For example, the first few years that they started pulling this oil out, the Norwegian people were not allowed to see any of it. It didn't go into the roads, it didn't go into the schools, or what have you. For the first few years, all of the money went back and reinvested into R&D, so that way getting the oil out became much, much cheaper by the government. After a few years of this, then what they had set up was all the profits would go into something called the Government Pension Fund, global. And then only the interest from that fund would be what would be used inside of the Scandinavian governments, right, to be used towards the schools and roads. So what we're basically saying is, like, even when this resource goes out, what we're setting up is a system whereby will continue to maintain itself in a financial way without having to rely on the resource in and of itself. That is an extreme amount of self-discipline and restraint that is required in order to devise a system like this. So when working on designs, especially on designs that are dealing with planned obsolescence, right, I try to get my team to start thinking about designs in terms of these words, making sure that they're laggard, that they have a sense of modesty, humility, that they have a sense of restraint and decency to them. The next word, we're going to go quick here, is from the language of mathematics. And in mathematics, equations are often the words or sentences that sort of make up our understanding of the universe. And I think in design, there are things that we can learn from equations that if we actually truly understand how to decipher the mathematics of it, that can lead to much better designs than what we sort of decipher in terms of simple words. This is an equation that describes something called Fitts' law. It's a human-computer interaction law that was developed by Paul Fitts. And basically what it says is, at a very fundamental level, is bigger things are easier to point at than smaller things. Which is an obvious concept, obviously. But if we go back to the etymology of this equation, we find a lot of interesting subtleties in terms of understanding how this sort of applies and how we can use these in more interesting ways than not. So, Paul Fitts was an Air Force researcher. And what he was meant to do was look into the research of designing airplane cockpits. This is a Douglas C-54 Skymaster DC-4. It's from 1942. And as you can see, this airplane cockpit is complicated as shit. And so what Paul Fitts was interested in was that if we're making experimental soft interfaces for the airplane pilot, this was a matter of life and death, trying to figure out what is the optimal way to design the dials, the switches, design the layout of all of the controls, so that way when they need to do something in a critical manner, they can do it as fast as possible. So this is an experiment that he figured out. And the way he designed it was that there would be two metal plates on either side, and he varied the width of the plates, and the people would have this metal stylus, and all they had to do was go from one point to the other, and they had to stop at the other metal plate at the other end. And then you would just measure the reaction time. And these are the variables of the equation. The width of the plate that they're going to, the distance between the plates, and the time it took to get to the plate. Here it is mapped out on the equation. Now what's interesting about this equation is that the relationship of these variables uses a logarithm. Right? There's a log base to that. And what's interesting about logarithms that a lot of people don't know about is that, here's what sort of shape. Linear in the blue line and logarithmic scale on the green line. And what's interesting about logarithms is that when we were born as babies, the logarithmic scale is actually how we understand numbers in the universe. That's what we're born with. And I'll give you the case. If you have one object, let's say an apple, and I give you another object, another apple, we understand that that is a significant change. It's a 100% increase in change. I double the amount of apples. But if I already have 10 apples, right, and I give you one more, even though that's the same linear increase in apples, right, it is less significant in terms of its change. So when it comes to Fitts' law, things that are tiny, when we make them a little bit bigger, significantly improve the speed at which we can point at them to access them. But if things are already large, it makes less of an impact. You don't get that much faster at pointing at objects. And because we understand logarithms, that makes all the difference in the world in terms of when we're trying to enact changes on our interface. A lot of people think, like, this should be bigger. And we know if it's already huge, we don't need to make it that much bigger because it's not going to make big enough impacts against the UI. Additionally, what I try to teach designers is that when you look at a mathematical equation, what makes it interesting is trying to figure out what are the relationships between the variables and then taking them to the extremes. And if we take them to the extremes, we can figure out what is the optimal setups or the suboptimal setups of the reaction. So I'm going to simplify this and just do it to 3 variables here. And the way you sort of figure this out is what is the ideal way that you want to set up your interface. So we want 0 time. We want everything that we try to access or point to take 0 seconds. That means it's the fastest possible way that I can always get to the thing that I want to get to. And then when we figure out it's a relationship. So things on the numerator should be 0, things on the denominator that have an inverse relationship should be at infinity, right? And that gets you to these numbers. So what are interfaces that have 0 distances? Well, contextual menus. So if you click on a box, instead of having going all the way to the top to click on the menu and get down all the different options for it, if you just right-click on the object itself, you're not moving any distance, therefore you get an interface that looks like this. Additionally, pie menus are considered some of the most efficient interfaces. Of course, the challenges are in terms of legibility of what needs to be done. But if I start right here, all of these objects have equal sort of efficiencies in terms of times to get to them. A lot of people are trying to come up with interesting pie menus, right, but none of them have been able to make it work due to challenges of sort of language description. Now, what about infinite widths? Right? If I try to get something infinite widths away, how do I make that work for infinite time? Well, it turns out on a monitor, we have a cursor here that I've blown up. The edges, when I take a cursor and get to the edge, it stops. And therefore, that dimension has an equivalent of an infinite width, which is interesting, right? So that means these edges here are some of the easiest places that we can get to, right? Because I can get to that far out pixel because the monitor is going to stop me automatically at that pixel. Additionally, the corners have infinite dimensions because I can get to the corners and both up and down, I'm going to stop at them. And as a result, we have interfaces that look like this, where expose and hot corners and spaces use the hotkeys of getting to the corners and to the edges of the interface, and then that's how we access the different features. This Vista, they have it set up where you take a window, drag it to the far edge, and make it half that screen size. It's an easy feature to get to because it helps take advantage of infinite widths inside of interface design. Now what's interesting, especially for website designers, is that web browsers don't get to take advantage of this interface. Right? We don't have infinite widths and heights because our cursor can go beyond the boundaries of sort of the web application or the browser. On mobile, there's lots of interesting occurrences. So this is WebOS, which got killed off by HP, but it has this really intuitive design in terms of like zooming out and seeing all your cards. You just drag your finger from down here at the edge and you just swipe upwards. And you can swipe to the left or right to move cards back and forth. It was considered a really sort of intuitive design. And while it did not succeed overall, the total quality management system. And two of the steps are these two concepts come from the Japanese language and culture. And having to do with quality. The first, autonomy and Shih Tzu, is taken for granted quality. That's sort of the equivalent definition. And what that means is that things will do just whatever that they're functionally supposed to do. A pen will write. Mediapateki in Shih Tzu is translated as enchanting quality. Right? That the pen will write in a way that it is pleasing for the person that is writing to hold and will create ink that is pleasing for the writer and the reader to see. Right? It's a different sense, an aesthetic beauty that is attached to the quality of an object to make people want to have it and desire it. The Japanese have this culture embedded inside of their culture, but lots of other companies have done this very well, Apple being obviously the most obvious. An ex-Apple employee, Gar Knowles, he wrote an essay called Why Design Matters. He said, companies are beginning to preach design internally and demand great design, not just of the product development teams, but all the departments. If organization's true brand is actually inside the company, then we sure as heck better make sure we have an internal climate that preaches great design. And all lies incredible design every day. Kathy here wrote an article about documentation. Why does all our marketing stuff look like this here on the left, but the actual documentation that's used by the people look like crap on the right? At Facebook, Yishan Wang, who's now the CEO of Reddit, spoke about tools, internal tools, the things that we work with at an internal level make all the difference in terms of productivity inside of the company. In our company, we spend a lot of our time, a third of our engineering research is on the internal tools that we use to support our product and app. This is designs that our consumers will never ever see, but are used by our employees every single day. And it's some of the best work that we do. These are apps that helps us do customer support, access marketing tools, look through people's accounts, debug them, do customer support at a high level. We have over 18 of them in our company. It's considered a core competency in our company. In summation, there's other languages, other concepts from cultures and other disciplines that can inform the way you do design inside of your company. What can you learn from them? And the more you reach out and expand the breadth of your knowledge, the better the polyglot you will be for dealing with design. That'll be it. I have to go to the next session. Thank you very much. Inc. We were a Tampa-based company. I'm going to have all the slides posted up on my Twitter account here, so you can subscribe to this. You don't have to worry about writing all the notes and content that I'm going to be going over today. So our company built a product called Wufoo. It's an online form builder. And it helps you create contact forms, design online surveys, and power event registrations. What's interesting about our software is that it's like Microsoft Access for the web, but it looks like it's designed by Fisher-Price. And even though it's so easy to use, we're used by every single marketing vertical that you could think of, and used by brands that you've probably heard of. In April 2011, we were acquired by SurveyMonkey, and all our entire team was moved out to the Silicon Valley area in Palo Alto. And what's interesting is that our team, even though we were so small, we're a group of 10 people, we were able to do some very, very interesting things. And I'll give you some numbers that sort of illustrate that. TechCrunch came up with this graph looking at the relationship between the funding amount that companies took and then sort of the valuation and acquisition or IPO. And the average startup raises $25.3 million and returns back to their investors a 676% rate of return. Wufoo only raised $118,000, a small seed fund from Y Combinator, and then we had 2 angels invest $50,000. We returned back to our investors 29,561%. A lot of people are sort of interested, why were we able to do this versus other teams? Why did we do this on the East Coast versus the West Coast? Why were we able to do this in Tampa, Florida? And the principles are really, really easy. We started to build our software. We weren't interested in creating any kind of software. We wanted software that people wanted to have a relationship. People wanted to say, I love this to death. And the reason this was is because we understood something fundamental about human culture. We're very sort of academically focused. And we know that human beings can't help themselves. The things that we interact with over and over and over again, we anthropomorphize them, and then we start creating relationships with them. So whether it's your car, your clothes, the house that you own, the tools that you use, the software that you buy, you attribute personality characteristics to them, and you have some kind of relationship with them and to the company that fosters and builds them. And how you manage those relationships can either help you or hurt you. So what we did was we took all that academic research and we applied them directly in 2 very specific ways. Right? We approached our new users as if we were trying to date them, and our existing users as if it was a long, sustainable marriage. Now when it comes to dating, first impressions make all the difference. You're sitting on a first date with someone, and you catch them picking their nose, that's probably going to be the end of the date. But if you're married to someone for 20 years, and they're sitting on the Barcalounger, and you catch them digging for gold, you don't immediately go to your lawyers and then start filing papers for divorce. Right? Shrug your shoulders and go, it's kind of hard to gold. There's something about the origin story of relationships, that beginning moments, where the threshold for success has to be very, very high. Because origin stories, the stories of our relationship, if I asked you to tell me the first kiss, first time you made love, how you proposed to your loved one, you know that story. It's a story you tell over and over again. And it's no different with the products and the companies that you interact with. They're the word-of-mouth stories. So, in a company, on a web application, the first impressions are pretty obvious, and these are the ones that everyone always focuses on. Home page, landing page, pricing page, login, and sign up. But I argue that there are lots of other first moments in your app where you can make the difference, where you can be a star player. I'll give you some examples. This is Wufoo's login. We're zoomed in here. See the dinosaur makes it a little bit different. But you hover over it, simple tooltip, goes, "Rawr!" It sets the tone for the kind of relationship you're going to have. It was a wine social network. We'll zoom in here. And this is the copy that they wrote on the page. Email address. It's also your sign-in name. It has to be legit. First name. It's what your mom calls you. Last name. What your army buddies call you. Password. Something you remember but hard to guess. Password confirmation. Type it again. Think of it as a test. Literally a poem. In contrast, this is Yahoo's sign-in page. What does it say about this, that this is their first impression? Now, what's unfortunate is that Flickr, which was acquired by Yahoo back in the early 2000s, this was their original sign-in page for Flickr. And it's one of my favorites because the call to action button is, get in there! Sense of passion and emotion. Sometimes confirmation pages will make all the difference. This is Photo Jojo's email newsletter. What it is a newsletter for sharing excellent photography tips. Right? So you fill it out, your email, and when you hit enter, it says, dude, you rule. Thanks for signing up, and you won't regret it. It's just different. Right? Helps stick inside of your mind. Helps you want to spread the word. This is Hale. Sometimes the places where people have a problem are opportunities to impress people. So Hale, it's a developer tool for testing HTTP requests. If you hit a URL that isn't going to work for you, their 404 page looks like this. Sometimes events or things when you're about to launch them, there's opportunities there to make a different kind of first impression. So when we rewrote our API to the third different version based on sort of REST principles, we wanted to have an API contest because we thought this is going to be the best one out there. Word of mouth spread like fire. We had so many applications and turn-ins about this. It was extremely successful. Cost us not very much money. We had over 20 different applications, including an iPhone app, an Android app, and a WordPress plugin. For the amount of money and time that we spent on this contest, we could not have paid and had these developed at the quality that they were. For more examples, we can go on and on like this. I highly recommend subscribing to a blog called Little Big Details, and they have all these little examples of apps doing really interesting and amazing things in very subtle ways that shows people, hey, this is something I'm doing for you that I'm designing that makes you care. Let's move on to long-term relationships. And the expert on this is John Gottman. He's a researcher up in Washington, close to 94%. John Gottman sees something in these video tapes. He sees that in how we fight, there's a secret there in terms of longevity. And it turns out one of the interesting insights was that it wasn't that successful married couples didn't fight at all, or people who were really good at being together, or people who were really bad together fought all the time. Turns out everybody fights. And we all fight about the same things. Money, kids, sex, time, and other. And time is things like what do we do in our free time, and other are things like jealousy and the in-laws. You can actually take all this stuff and you can map them to a company or the products that you're building. So if there's problems with the cost and the billing issues, people are going to fight with you. People are going to give you customer support. If you're building a tool that helps them manage clients, anything that happens to that company's clients, they're going to have a fuss about. Performance, it's all about how long you're up and how fast when it comes to web software. Roadmap, what are you working on? What is the next feature that you're going to be building out? And I said jealousy and in-laws for others. And that is competition and partnerships. Anything that's weird about those things, people will complain about. But what's interesting about the things that people want to fight about is that if you look at a conversion funnel, something that's sort of typical like this, customer support is what happens in between each of one of the steps. It's the reason people fall off of the funnel. And when you're trying to get people to become paying and staying users, not addressing these issues in between these steps, not figuring out how to fight effectively, going to reduce your conversion rate. So, what are the things that we do that sort of deal with fighting? And ours is a very simple, holistic approach. And it's based on this idea that we saw about traditional software development, that the people who make the software are divorced from the consequences of the things that they're building. And as a result, things they design don't always align with the things that the customers want or need. And this has to do with the way most software companies get started. Before launch, when it's just 3 people sitting in a garage, all you're doing is building a product. You don't have any customers. It's pure active creation. And sometimes, especially with technical co-founders, that's the thing that everyone loves to do. And then after launch, we have to deal with users. And there's all this other crap we have to deal with. And so what ends up happening at most technology companies is that the founders really try to figure out, how do I outsource this inside of the company? Divide and conquer. Build out these divisions that don't work together, right? It says, these are the crappy things I don't like to deal with. I'm going to make a division, and all they have to do is work on crappy stuff. Nobody wants to be in the crappy division. So we came up with this idea called software-driven development. And what it does is try to inject these 3 principles: responsibility, accountability, and humility back into the software development process. And it's really easy. Just make everyone do customer support. There's no ifs, ands, buts about it. And what ends up happening is the creators become the supporters. So, I'll give you some information about this. Support responsible developers and designers, give the best support. And what I mean by this is that at the time that we sold the SurveyMonkey, this is the last public set of numbers that I can share, we had 500,000 users, we had about 5 million people using the Wufoo form whether they knew it or not, interacting with our software. We had about 400 issues a week, resulted in about 800 emails, and our reaction time with a 10-person company was 7 to 12 minutes. And the way we did this is really simple. We focused on getting people to help themselves. We spent a lot of time on frequently asked questions, documentation that is just spectacular, some of the best you'll ever see, with tons of screencasts, well organized, and very in-depth, that anybody in the company can edit and update. Tooltips all over the app to tell you how to use different features. And when you click on even the Help tab at the top, depending on where you are in the app, it will take you to the exact documentation that you're going to need, as opposed to the general documentation page. This is what our documentation looks. Now, this version of the documentation that we came up with resulted in a 25% decrease in customer support requests overnight. And this has to do with experimentation, because we had all our engineers working on this stuff. And I'll tell you one interesting experiment that we did. Kathy Sierra did this talk. She writes this blog called Creating Passionate Users. And she said, there's this interesting disconnect between the emotions of the people who need customer support and the people who are giving the customer support. Right? They're just too happy, too upbeat, and therefore that disconnect causes conflicts in terms of the tone, understanding, and the receptiveness of the support that's being given to them. Right? Too much MBA speak. So one of the ways that we can improve this is that in face-to-face interactions, we can read nonverbal language cues and use that to change the tone of our sort of support that we provide, especially in retail environments. So we could not build face recognition software on the web, but we do know forms really well. So we added a drop-down called the emotional state drop-down. Made this as neutral as possible, because we didn't want it to say, how does this make you feel? Because that sentence reminds you of a douchebag psychiatrist sitting on a couch. So we said, this is super neutral. And in this experiment, we didn't make it required, and we actually didn't think anyone was going to fill it out. We just wanted to see what would happen, because we wanted to play around with that concept of, could we get more emotional context, and would it change how we do customer support? Because we're fanatical about creating strong relationships. And it turns out, 75.8% of people filled out the emotional drop-down field. What's amazing about that is the browser type field, only 78.1% filled out that field. So basically, people who have the technical support problems with our software is basically telling us, knowing my emotional state is just as important as knowing what kind of browser I'm using. Additionally, we found out that users, if you set up a system where it's first come, first serve, and you don't allow them sort of, we don't triage based on the emotional state that people have, people don't try to game the system. So overall, people were within the parameters of what they expected. Most people were confused, most people were worried about different issues, and all the other sort of attributes made sense with sort of the quality ratings we were getting for customer support. The other thing that was interesting is that not only was our customer support better than everyone else's because the people who could fix the problem were the ones at the forefront, it turns out our people were getting much better at designing software. And this has to do with the fact of some studies that were done by Jared Spool. He's over at User Interface Engineering. And he looked at all these different UX teams, and he noticed that direct exposure, you need a minimum of every 6 weeks, it has to be for at least 2 hours with the customers directly. If you don't have this, your UX team, your design team, is going to continue getting worse. The designs of your software will continue to separate from what the customers want and expect. Our employees, every single one of them, whether you're a bookkeeper, a designer, or the software engineer, or the founder of the company, we're doing between 4 and 8 hours of support every single week. This is the calendar of our support shifts at the time. And in 2008, when it was even just 3 people, we won Jakob Nielson's Best Application UI of 2008. It was a 3-person company competing against teams with giant UI teams, right? Now, what happens on a financial level when you make everyone do remarkable support in the company? This is our user growth curve for the first 4 years of Wufoo. We spent $0 on traditional marketing avenues. All of this from word of mouth, high-quality customer support. The reason I'm showing 2 graphs here is because most people, especially in IT and technology, are worried about how do I scale my system so that we can accommodate this kind of growth curve. But for us, we had a different principle. We're like, this is our customer support growth curve. How do we make this so this is as scalable as possible? Because we knew we didn't want to have a giant mammoth company that wasn't going to be intimate, right? And the ways we did this are interesting, but they're not new, right? You might say that, hey, this might work for your kind of company, right? But that's not going to work for mine. I have a different size, I have a different type of set, vertical, market, whatever. Craigslist, the founder, the way Craig Newman describes himself is customer support representative, right? It's a team of, I think, like 16 people now, making millions of dollars of revenue. Amazon, they make every single person at Amazon work at the call center 1 week every year. FreshBooks, before you can start doing your job, you have to work at least 2 months doing customer support. And at the end of the 2-month period, they have this crazy sort of graduation ceremony. So this person was interested in video games, so they turned the entire office into Super Mario Brothers obstacle course. Rackspace, a company that has gone IPO and can say they are one of the largest cloud distributed systems for hosting out there. Great technology, great personnel, great knowledge, great R&D. But the way they advertise themselves is not by any of those characteristics. They say at the forefront, when you come to Rackspace, you're going to get the best fanatical support you're ever going to get. Kayak.com is one of my favorite. Paul English, he created this system where all of his engineers had to do customer support. And there's this great quote where he was asked, why would you pay $150,000 for an engineer to do customer support when you can pay someone $10 an hour in another state to do it instead? And he goes, well, after the 2nd or 3rd time that the same customer support request comes in from the engineers will stop what they're doing, fix the problem, and then we don't have that problem anymore. The last thing about long-term relationships that is crucial to know in terms of longevity is that John Gottman looked at it and saw that there's 2 types of relationships that were ending. There's relationships that would end within 4 years, and then there were other kinds of relationships that would go on for 10 to 15 years. And as soon as the kids go off to college, boom, it ended in divorce. And he could not figure out why. Because all the other characters that he figured out about fighting didn't apply to these people. And it turns out relationships are like the second law of thermodynamics, in that closed energy systems tend to run down. If you don't continue putting energy back into the system, it will fall apart. And these relationships just didn't have a spark, right? People didn't do things to constantly surprise and revive the relationship over time. Therefore, it got stale and fell apart. Now, in a company, the ways that we try to keep people on becoming a staid and passionate user of the system, the traditional ways is like we have a blog, we have an email newsletter to let people know about the different kinds of stuff. And we noticed that only 5% of our users were subscribed to the blog, and only 30% of people that were getting the emails were opening them. We just weren't reaching everyone. People didn't know to the extent that we were caring about them and building new features for them. So we built this new internal tool that's called the alert system. And the software alert system, what it allows you to do is say, hey, you built a new feature inside of Wufoo, engineer comes in, enters it in there, and has a timestamp on there. And it has a link to a blog post that talks about that feature. And then inside of Wufoo, when a person logs into the system, it comes up, it looks at the person's last time that they logged in, and then finds all the features that are implemented since the last time. So it's always customized per the user. And every time that they log in, they'll see all the different things that have happened since they've been gone. To this day, this is still one of the most popular features in Wufoo that I hear about when I'm talking to my customers. They say, I love your software. That since you've been gone thing, man, I just know that you guys are always working on stuff and let me know that it's getting better and better over time.
I love that.
Thank you.
Love it.
The other thing that we do to also keep the romance alive is say, everyone in our company, yes, you have to do customer support, but you also have to thank the people that pay your paycheck. So on Fridays when we had our team meetings, every single person in the company has to write 5 to 10 thank you cards to the customers. It just comes up in a queue, we write some software, they can come it up. These pictures are pictures that our users have posted up of the thank you cards that they've received. As you can see, they're not fancy. Just a blank card with a dinosaur sticker on it, you write the word thanks, and then a heartfelt message that say, we want you to know they've been with us for a while. We know that we can't do this without you. I'm really appreciative of you allowing us to do what we can. We'll help you stick around. It makes all the difference in the world. In terms of both our users and the way they perceive us, but also the way our users perceive our users. Right? They're not pain in the asses and things that I have to deal with and people who cause customer support tickets. Right? It humanizes the people that they're working for, and therefore the software becomes more humanized, and therefore people want to have a relationship with that humanized software. I'm going to end with this note, because there's a lot of hippie, emotional, touchy-feely stuff that we talked about today. So I'll give you some hard MBA advice. Michael Treacy and Fred Wazirma, they wrote a study for the Harvard Business Review, and they said, there are only 3 ways that you become a market leader. And depending on how you want to become the market leader in your market or vertical, you have to discipline yourself to work on a very specific type of attribute. And the 3 ways you can become the market leader is through best price, best product, and the best overall solution. Now, if you want to be the best price out there, then what you have to focus on in your company is logistics. Walmart, for instance, figures out how to get all those trucks and all that inventory moved around in an efficient way, so therefore their prices can be as low as possible. If you want to be the market leader, because you have the very, very best product out there, you focus all of your energy on R&D. Apple's a very good example of that. And the last solution, if you want to be the best overall solution, the one people say is like, you go to this, and then overall the experience you're going to get from this, you're going to be really wowed by it. You focus on something called being customer intimate. And this is a strategy that's usually used by hotels and hospitality groups like restaurants. And what's interesting is that for any kind of startup, the one that is successful always to a company or organization that has little resources, little time, and little manpower is the last one. You can always be intimate with your customers. And you can always use that as a leverage to increase the word of mouth, strengthen your relationships, and ultimately build products that users love. This is Kevin Hale. I'll tweet out the slides for this here. Any questions for Lee? Thank you.